Hello, my dear students in Religion and Society. This is our first major lecture on the subject. For today, we will be discussing the various controversies or philosophies concerning the definition of religion. Now, I would like to advise that whenever we mention religion here, I'm not talking of Christianity in itself or in particular, but religion as a whole, and we will be treating the subject of religion and society from both philosophical and sociological perspectives rather than from a theological viewpoint, because it is proper for this particular subject that we study the underlying currents of thoughts that are the foundations of a certain perspective of how to treat religion. The way you filter the information and the very questions that you ask is actually influenced by your own philosophies. Sometimes that philosophy is not really clear to the observer, especially if you study this field without philosophical background, and so you just are familiar with the principles, but actually those principles are called from certain philosophies. Okay, now let me introduce myself in terms of my idea. I belong to a, shall we say, school of thought that believes in an objectivity of truth, and I do not believe in what we call as the relativism, no? Both in terms of effect or causal. No? So my perspective is, I believe that there is absolute truths that is of course coming from a Thomistic background, and I believe that there is something out there that needs to be discovered regardless or independent of the observer. So my way of treating this subject will be coming from critical realism. Now take note of the term. We will be treating the subject from the perspective of critical realism. I'm not sure if you have the same idea of what critical realism is, but critical realism tells us to think of all science as learning about what exists and how and why it works. And so that's for me what critical realism does. No? It allows us to tells us to think of all science as learning about what exists, how, and why. So what, how, and why it exists. Now, what exists is a matter of ontology, the being. And how things work is about relational causal influences. Okay, so there are two things that we have to be understood here, that we need to understand. I mean, the ontology, that is what the thing is, and how it works, that is the causal, the relational causal influences. Now, critical realism focuses our attention on identifying important objects. Number one, which includes, of course, social objects, and that is in terms of sociology, that exists in realities. On entities, of course, that is the ends or the ontology, using empirical evidence and our best reasoning abilities to learn what causal powers those objects possess and can exert under certain conditions, which is causal mechanism. And developing from that in terms of its existence, ends of being, and the causal powers that influence that being exerts, and developing from it knowledge, explanations of how and why complex world operates the way it does to produce conditions and outcomes of interest. In other words, we will be theorizing the social ontology of religion and describe how and why religion operates causally in human life as it does. Many other approaches tend to be skittish about naming what religion essentially is and either avoid the idea of causal explanation altogether and sometimes misconstrue the reality of the causality. But it is impossible to do good social science while bracketing ontology and sidelining causality. So, there are three things now that we have to be aware in this kind of philosophical engagement with sociology. Number one, and they are held together. Now take note, the three of these are components of the way we understand sociology. First is that reality exists. This is what I meant kanina, I believe in the objective outside reality. Reality exists and operates. There are realities that exist and operates independently of our human awareness. And that is what we call as ontological realism. No? So, it is real in itself without the mediation of the human mind. In other words, even if I don't know this thing, it exists. So, because actually this is referring to that vague, or rather to that vogue and trendy idea nowadays that everything seems to be constructs na lang, imaginary constructs. Okay? So, something exists. Whether we're aware of it or not, it exists. This is in contrast to that idea that something only exists if I am aware of it. So, which is different from what I'm saying. So, we believe that in the study of social realities, there are things there that exist independent of our own subjective opinions or of our own meaning making or so on and so forth. Okay? That our knowledge about reality is always historically and socially situated and conceptually mediated. Okay? Now, so there are things that exist regardless of my awareness, but now that I have come to the point of knowing a particular thing, my knowledge of what that social reality is always historically and socially situated and conceptually mediated, and that is epistemic perspectivalism. No? So, epistemology. Now, this is in the field of epistemology. In this particular view, is epistemic perspectivalism. So, in other words, things as we understand it, if it comes to our awareness, would always be conditioned by our own historical and sociological social situations and are conceptually mediated, which means that, for example, a very good example of this is the BLM movement in the United States. This is really an opposite of what I'm saying here. Because what they are doing is they are trying to cancel those men and women in the past because they own slaves. For example, George Washington, they are trying to topple the statues of George Washington. Why is it so? Because they are applying their concept of they're applying their concept of the slave or the emancipation of the black lives of the blacks to the past. And that, and therefore, if that is the case, no one can be really safe, because during the time of Washington, it was socially and culturally accepted to have slaves. And it has not come yet to the awareness of those people in the past to be able to understand that this is wrong from the perspective of the now, of the present. So, in our study of sociology, or rather of religion, we will be looking at religion from the perspective of epistemic perspectivalism. If we have this, we can see that we cannot apply the learnings, the awareness that we have, for example, way back to that of the Crusades. Like, would you condemn the Crusades for invading the Muslim countries? Of course you cannot. Because for them, they have a different awareness of the social realities that are conditioned by their own specific historical and social realities. You cannot just have one single criterion for everybody across history. So that's one thing. Okay? In this, epistemic perspectivalism is connected to that which is judgmental rationality. Although we are historically and socially situated and conceptually mediated in terms of our understanding, it does not stop the human person, it does not stop us over time to improve our knowledge about what reality is. To adjudicate, which means to judge, to make a choice between rival accounts, and so to make justified truth claims about what is real and how it works. No? So that's judgmental rationality, which means that, okay, so while we cannot judge the people of the past with our own criteria, we can adjudicate ourselves that there are things that are considered wrong or good in the past that is not very clear now, or the vice versa. There are things in the past that seems to be good, but we have come to the reality that it is not good at all. Just like, for example, in the case of slavery, although here in the Philippines, it's not really the big deal because we don't have that history wherein we are enslaved. Although some sociologists will portray that the Filipinos were enslaved by the Spaniards, but that is far from the truth, no? Because we have a very vibrant and robust social realities during the Spanish occupation, and so it does not stick, no? That idea that we were enslaved. No? Actually, we were enslaved by our own. And even slavery in itself is not really existing in the way that it exists in the American culture or milieu. So those are the three things that we have to be very careful and to be aware of in our understanding of what religion is. So we are using critical realism. In the critical realism, there are three important things that we have to take note of. That is, the realities are in itself existing, how it works, and why it works. And basically, this is summarized in the so-called ontological realism, epistemic perspectivalism, and judgmental rationality. Ontological realism tells us that social realities exist in itself regardless of our awareness of it. So whether we are aware or not aware, there are realities that exist. Second, our human knowledge about reality, in this case social realities, is always historically and socially situated and conceptually mediated. And last, the third principle is that uh, although we believe in the epistemic perspectivalism, it does not stop us from making a adjudication as to what is right or wrong over time when our knowledge when our human knowledge, of course, improves, no, about certain realities, and so we can make a justified truth claims about what is real and how it works, and that is judgmental rationality. Now, all these three beliefs must go together to promote the acquisition of human knowledge. And these are the things that are important here in our study. Okay. So, okay. Now let us proceed to our definition of what is religion. The first step to understand religion is identifying what religion is. So, what are we talking about? Scholars have long argued over many rival definitions of religion. Some have given up trying to define it. Others have decided that religion does not even exist out there to be studied and understood, but is only a modern Western invention imposed on the world for political and religious purposes. On the other hand, religion, from a critical realism perspective, we believe that it's real. It exists. There is that social reality. There's a reality that we call, that what we consider now as religion. It's distinctive and enduring part of human life that we can describe its nature in specific terms. Now, to properly identify what religion is, we need to do three things. First, we must turn our attention away from the various debated concepts of religion and focus instead on the reality of religion as it is found in actual human lives and societies. So you see, we focus on what is existing rather than focusing on so much concepts. How is religion existing in societies and social context? No? So how is it existing in in the in the actuality rather than having conceptual definitions? So our initial point of reference needs to be not the many different ways by which one can think about religion, but the concrete realities of religions in the world that we are trying to think about. So the second point is we need to put on hold our interest in the ideas and beliefs of religious people and concentrate on the religious practices that is repeated, religiously meaningful behaviors. And so, we do not want to dissect religion or study religion from the beliefs of certain religions. So, we will not be dealing with, for example, how Christianity differs from the Buddhist, for example. That's why at the start of this video, I was telling it this is not going to be theological, because that is not the interest of this course, I believe. So, but rather, we consider ourselves as a kind of external observers of what religion is, trying to imitate or mimic a pseudoscience. Forgive me for those who are sociologists, but trying to mimic a kind of empirical way of looking at things. Now, that is how we think, because there are also sociological theories that would push for uh, the who would like to push for and involve study of social realities, no? And so we are in two different way of looking at things. One is that telling us that we have to be an external observer. The other one is that an immersed observer. So we will not debate into that, and I will leave that to the sociologists, to those social studies majors, majors in social studies, who would to think about it. Pero from the perspective of critical realism, that's how we do it. We do not deal with the concepts of each religion, but in terms of the practices, the actual practices that are meaningful to that particular society or particular people. And third, we must do more than just think about the various arguments for and against the different views of religion. And we need to make a rational judgment. I already mentioned that rational judgment and rationality, which approaches seems to be better and to serve and deserves our consent to that particular definition. Now, I will be using the definition of Smith, Christian Smith, because I believe he is a good author, and I do believe in his ideas, no? Compared to some too much liberal ideological treatment of sociology. So, what is religion now? And this is the definition. And I would like you to take note of this, because at the end of the class, I will ask you to propose or to analyze the particular definition from your own perspective. Okay? So, this is the definition, and please take note. Religion is a complex. Religion is a complex, not a complex as in complicated, but a complex, that means an aggregate. Religion is a complex of culturally prescribed practices based on premises about the existence and nature of superhuman powers, whether personal or impersonal, which seeks to help practitioners gain access to and communicate or align themselves with these powers in hopes of realizing human goods and avoiding things bad. Okay, so let me repeat that. Religion is a complex of culturally prescribed practices based on premises about the existence and nature of superhuman powers, whether personal or impersonal, which seeks to help practitioners gain access to and communicate or align themselves with these powers in hopes of realizing human goods and avoiding things bad. Now, notice there are the three things in critical realism is very obvious here in this particular definition. What is the being of the ontological? And then how it works and why it works. Okay, let us look. So what is it? What is that thing called religion? And according to Smith, it is a complex of culturally prescribed practices which are based on the premises about the existence and nature of superhuman powers, whether that is personal or impersonal. Because there are divine powers or superhuman powers that are not really personal, like, for example, nirvana or some other concepts like the Tao. No, they are impersonal. But for the monotheistic religion, it is personal. The superhuman power is personal. So we have Allah for the Muslim, of course the God of Israel, and the God of the Christians, Jesus as the second person, so on and so forth. So it's personal. So there are impersonal superhuman powers, and there are personal superhuman powers. Okay. So now you notice in the very definition of this of religion, it did not deal with conceptual distinctions. Rather, it dealt with the practices. So what is part of the definition is that it is a complex of culturally prescribed practices, and it is based on the premise of a belief about the existence of the nature of a certain human powers, no? Whether impersonal or personal. The how. Why is the how of religion? So it seeks to gain access, communicates, or align themselves, no? The people. No? So that's the how of it. The how of religion is it is trying to gain access. So I practice religion because I want to gain access, communicate, or align myself to the superhuman power by the use of these prescribed practices. The why of the definition is because it hopes to realize, it hopes to achieve that which is which is good for me or for the practitioner, and to avoid evil or to avoid something bad. So you see now the definition of Smith is critical realism. We do not deal with the definitions of other conceptual, but it is very practical and observable. So the what is the ends, the ontology, it is a complex, a collection, an aggregate of culturally prescribed practices which is based on the premise of the existence of superhuman powers, whether that is a belief in a personal superhuman power as personified in the monotheistic gods, or even among the many other gods, no? Like Krishna, Shiva, or Agni, or the Shintos like Amaterasu, Omikami, and so on and so forth. So those are personified. The superhuman powers is personified. Or impersonal superhuman powers like the Tao of Taoism or the Nirvana of the Buddhism. Okay? And the how of it, the how of religion, how religion operates. Well, religion seeks to communicate with that, to connect with that particular superhuman power through the prescribed, culturally prescribed practices for the purpose of, that's the end of it, that's the end. So the means is the culturally prescribed, and so that you can communicate, that's the means, and the end is the what we call as the avoidance of evil or something that is bad, misfortunes, and to have good fortunes, goodness, no? In so many forms. Now take note, when I say good, the human goods, I'm not just saying merely like you become successful, prosperity. Salvation is also a human good. Avoiding things bad, condemnation to hell is something bad. No, so when I say this thing, you do not just imagine, is it a very materialistic way of looking into what the end of religion is? No, that is not. So we have to go beyond that comparison. I mean that frame. That when I say human goods, I am only saying here in terms of the material. No, salvation, healing, heaven. While the bad includes also hell, suffering, and so on and so forth. Okay? So, now let us look into the terms here. Superhuman powers means here that these powers are believed to be able to influence or control significant parts of reality that are usually beyond direct human intervention. And this is the reason why humans needs the help of that superhuman powers, because it is beyond the capacity of man to do something about it. So they have to ask for that for the help of that particular superhuman power. An example of that, for example, there's drought. So what do? You pray to the rain god, or you do. So how do you perform rain dance? So that's in the primitive concepts, like with shamanism, for example. They have, but not even only in the primitive religion, but even in the Jewish circles, that there are miracle workers there, and there are stories in the Talmud, for example, that certain rabbi can perform certain actions that can bring forth rain. So we have a very famous rabbi, a mystic. I forgot his name, but he is known as the rainmaker, and because he knows how to make rain. In fact, there's a story in the Talmud. I think it's the Talmud. I'm not sure if it is in the Talmud or in other writings. There was this, I think, explains the definition, illustrates the definition well. Okay, so there was a drought in a certain place, and there was this famous rabbi who is considered to be a miracle worker. And they asked this rabbi to pray to God for rain, because it has already destroyed a lot of crops and lives. They really need to have rain. And so the rabbi went to the forest. He kindled a fire and said the prayers. So you see, he kindled the fire and said the prayers, and rain came. Of course, the rabbis, as usual, they have students or disciples, and later generations, there was again another drought. And so they approached the disciple of this original rainmaker rabbi. And the rabbi, unfortunately, do not know how to make the fire. But he still went to the forest, ignited the fire. No, he wasn't able to ignite the fire, and said the prayers. And rain came. After several generations, there was again a terrible drought, and they approached another disciple of the original rabbi down the generations. That means the first two are already dead, and this rabbi now doesn't know how to light the fire. He doesn't know where the forest is, but he knows the prayer. And so what he did was, he did not go to the forest. He was not able to kindle the fire, but he still knew the prayer, and rain came. Then after several generations, again another great drought happened, and the people came to the student of this rabbi, and they asked that this particular current rabbi to pray. But he doesn't know where the forest is. He doesn't know how to kindle the fire, and he doesn't know the prayers to be said. But still, he just talked to God and prayed in his own words, and then rain still came. So you see, in this particular story, this is a very good illustration of religion in this particular definition. So what is it? a variety, a complex, a collection of prescribed activities, and that's the how to go, what forest to go to, the fire, how to kindle the fire, and what prayers to be said. And what's the reason for going to the forest, kindling the fire, and saying the prayers to connect to the divine, to God. For what end? For a good, and that is the rain. So that's how it is defined by Smith. No? That's a very good illustration, I believe, of religion in a particular sense. Okay, I will discuss for those of you who are familiar with the Durkheimian definition or separation of religion and magic. I will discuss that later with you. I will discuss that later. No, for just in case you're talking about, oh, is it not that seems to be magical, or is it not does not this thing belong to the magic as defined by Durkheim? Well, according to Smith, well, it does look as if it belongs there. So for Smith and for critical realism, it doesn't really matter. No, so if it seems to be like magical, it's probably religion must have started something like that. But that is not yet the point that I'm trying to drive here, and we will discuss that later. So another defining feature of superhuman powers is that according to the religious communities take their existence in nature as premises, they are not human creations. Part of the very superhumanness of these religious powers is that they believe to be independent upon human invention, activity, or production to exist. People may need to feed, please, or replenish the superhuman powers, but they do not create them. Now, this is in answer to that idea, especially in philosophy. I forgot who said this, but there's one philosopher that says that God is the projection of all the human motivations and desires and aspirations. In other words, the human person have our desires, our motivations, our ideas, and we project it outside of us, and we call it God. So that's it, no? So but that is one of the perspectives of religion. But for me, I do not subscribe to that. And as I said, because of the philosophy that I am trying to expound here, and my belief is God exists, whether independent. I mean, I use the word God, and sorry, it carries a lot of meaning. The superhuman powers that is explained in this particular definition is independent of the human person in terms of its existence. It exists. It doesn't exist because we think that it exists. No, it exists. Although in some ways we have to feed it, just like what the Hindus, for example, are doing. They are feeding it, and in terms of the mana, wherein they have to replenish it on certain days, for example, the magical powers of a particular object. Yan. Pero for us, it exists. I mean, the critical realism, although we feed it, we replenish the powers, etc., we renew its vigor, that is not the point. The point is that superhuman power exists not as a human invention or a projection of our desires and motivations and ideals. No. And now, humans engage in various practices to try to access and realize the goods from these powers. But the key difference is that they are the products of human design and activity, and so are not powerful in the way that religious superhuman powers are. So what do I mean? Okay, so we create rituals. Those are human creations, rituals, or liturgy, for example. Liturgy, I'm talking here of the sacraments. Again, ganun naman sa mind ng mga religious studies here, students. No, what I'm saying here is the collection of prescribed activities. They are, of course, we claim, now this is where we do not enter, of course, sacraments are claimed to be divinely instituted. Pero from a sociological point of view, we just treat it not as terms of theology. So we can say that these are human inventions, which means that they are created by man. For example, the Mass, the Mass that we have now is different in terms of its form and appearance from the Mass of the Ambrosian Rite, for example, or the Tridentine, compared to the Vatican II Mass. And who made the Vatican II Mass? Of course, it's the human person we created. The commission on that particular area created that ritual. Pero of course, we know that that is based on the Eucharist instituted by Jesus, but that is theology already. No? So we're just treating this for a meantime from a sociological point of view. And so when we see it, when we look at it, the sacraments now are human inventions. From a sociological point of view, I don't want you to misunderstand me. Baka masay, ano ba sa Father? Naging heretic na? No. Because we're treating things from sociology. Okay? And not from theology. Like, for example, the rituals of the Buddhists, for example. So who made that? Of course, the Buddhists themselves, the practitioners of Buddhism. And sometimes we have to invent our own ways of communicating with God. Okay? So, this definition purposely avoids the ideas supernatural, transcendent, ultimate, God, spirits, higher beings, holy, luminous, ultimate concern, the sacred for good. Now, debates about defining religion have taught us none of these terms are adequate, for example. And so the idea of the supernatural presupposes a distinction between the natural and the supernatural. Okay, that's why you may be asking, why is it you cannot just call it divine or the divine powers or the divinity? Because as I said, it might be, it carries a lot of load in terms of meaning. But the supernatural would give us a very good distinction between the natural and the supernatural, which is opposed to the natural. Okay, so a similar problem comprises the idea that religion concerns the transcendent. Now, this is problematic when we say transcendent. That means beyond the ordinary, beyond the material. Because there are religions, there are so many human religions that have conceived the superhuman powers in the, for example, in the trees or in the rivers. So you see the problem with defining that power in terms of transcendent power. Because there are religions that considers this from the perspective of, like, for example, the Shinto. For the Shinto, their kami, the kami, or it's very difficult to translate it into English, their divinities, maybe, or their gods and goddesses, they do not exist beyond this world. But they are connected to the streams, for example, or Amaterasu, Omikami, for example, is connected to the sun. But not in the sense of a transcendent in the way we understand it, Catholics or Christians, that this world and the beyond this world. No? So it's not possible to use the word transcendent in that sense. And the sacred. Now, we do not also make a demarcation of the sacred here, as because many people treat the sacred, some people treat as sacred which we cannot reasonably be considered as religious. The word itself has been meaning, in terms of the meaning, there are ways by which we use the word sacred not to mean holy, but that's which is sacred to me, which is important to me. Like, for example, the nation, or maybe golf, or shopping is sacred to me. It's a sacred time for me, sacred space. So we do away with that term. So, of course, human cultures always involve sacred things, but those things are not always religious. No? For example, my me time is my sacred time. And we have heard a lot about it in this in the recent years, wherein we heard a lot about this is my sacred space, this is my sacred time, but it's not necessarily religious in that sense, no? And that arise to the so-called I am spiritual but not religious. So among the terms, well, as I already mentioned, that's it. The superhuman powers seems to be, according to Smith, the most appropriate term. Now, let us go to the part that says about a complex of culturally prescribed practices. So, practices are culturally meaningful behaviors that are intentionally repeated over time, much as making yearly offerings to the spirits of one's ancestors or praying every night before going to sleep. So, it's repeated. All four of those elements, meaning, it has to have a meaning, it has to be shown in our behavior, it has to be intentional and repetitive. Must be present in the activity, though not necessarily in the mind of the practitioner, to count as a genuine practice. Once person's mindless behavior habit, such as repeatedly scratching chin, is not a true practice by this account. So it is not culturally prescribed, it's hardly intentional, and has no broader meaning, cultural meaning. Now, so there are things that so there are four elements in the what we call practices, no? That it can be considered as within the ambit of religion. It has to be meaning, it has meaning, behavior, intentionality, and repetition. So religions are formed from networks of practices grouped together into complexes. A single practice does not make a religion. So one does not simply burn some incense or pray some sutras or some scriptures and then that becomes a religion. No, it has to be a complex and aggregate, a collection of various culturally prescribed activities. And when they combined, each one enriches the other. So, the folded hands, for example, when we pray, we fold our hands in reverence, is appropriate to prayer. And prayer provides the expressive purpose with content for the folded hands. So you see, it's combination. You just not fold your hands for the sake of folding your hands. You fold your hands because you are praying. And praying is again another practice which makes it also gives meaning to the folded hand. Okay, the folded hand could just be a folded hand if it has no connection to another practice. No? Okay, so that's the point. No, so you cannot just say that because you practice one particular culturally prescribed, and you have your religion already. No, it has to be complex. A complex, no, or an aggregate or a collection. And of course, we know that the combined meaning becomes more than the parts. So, folding hands is more than just folding your hands, like two hands with the palms touching each other. Kung mo na siya, if it is not in the context of prayer, then that is just like this. It has no, well, that's the only thing. You just put your hands together, palms together. Pero if there is the context of prayer, the meaning of the folded hands goes beyond just merely two palms touching each other. Okay? So religious practices are always culturally prescribed. The stipulations may cover which practices to perform, how to perform, when, where, and in what situation. Okay? So That's why it is prescribed culturally, because there are things to be considered in the practice of it. That is, which one to practice, which is appropriate, how to perform it correctly, when, where, and in what situation. And there are people who can do this prescriptions. No? Whether it's a shaman, a priest, or a lay person, or certain groups, no, wherever you have in particular religion, they're allowed to engage in that particular practice. So in addition, they are also prescribed for individuals, or by groups, or by the entire nation itself. So Christianity seems to lack a kind of a nationality in terms of its religion. Unlike, for example, Shinto. In Shinto, it is a national religion, and the entire nation practice that particular prescribed cultural practice, perform, that particular prescribed practice as a nation. And now, for example, you will say, I think we also have like our Holy Week, in the entire nation celebrates it. No, the entire nation, in the sense that almost all Filipinos in the nation, the Philippines, are practicing it together, but they are practicing it as a group, not as a nation in itself. Unlike that of the Shinto, no? Example, when the emperor ascends to the throne, he goes to the national shrines. One of that is in the shrine of Amaterasu Omikami, and as the head of the nation, the emperor stays overnight in the tent that they made specifically for the purpose, and then he offered the harvested rice in behalf of the entire Japanese people, because he is serving as the head of the Japanese people, something like that. So it's national in the sense. Okay. So what is it here? Institutionalization. So because of this, there is the institutionalization of practices. Okay, because it is prescribed. So therefore, religion eventually will have an element of institutionalization because of the prescriptions. Who will be the one to determine it if there is no institution? Of course, again, do not think of a very rigid institutionalization of these practices, because it can also be a group that is not really that hierarchical, but it can also be. And because of that, it is also important that the next generation of believers inherit the practices historically. Hindi pwedeng wala sa inherit, because it's very important, or else every generation will have to create its own rituals. Okay? Now here is the question now, which I have posed a while, with Emile Durkheim, among others, that he insisted on the distinction between religion and magic. In this view, religion is by definition a social fact, socially constituted and practiced. Now, there's a strong social element in the definition of Durkheim, and therefore requiring collective practices to exist. Magic, by contrast, is thought to be a different species of human activity, partly because it is often a social practice performed by individual clients for instrumental personal reasons rather than taking place socially as a matter of group solidarity. So, this is for Durkheim very important in terms of the distinction. So, kung socially yan, together with others, it becomes religion. Pero kung individual lang, it becomes magic. Yan. That's how he sees it. But for Smith, and that is for critical realism, it doesn't matter for us, no? In our subject, in our way of dealing religion, it doesn't really matter. Because the collective performance of practices is not an essential feature of religion. And it's not an essential, because I can practice my religion alone. For example, I am in communist China, and I'm the only Catholic there. I can still practice my own religion without being socially connected with others, no? Which is the weakness of the Durkheimian definition, because it's a socially compacted. No? So, how about if I am alone? Would my practice now of religion becomes magical? That's the big. Or, for example, I am the only one who prays the in my family. For example, you're the only one who was devotion to the Sacred Heart, and the rest of your family doesn't have, and you don't go to church on First Fridays, and just there's no way for you to go because you're living in in Saudi, for example, but you keep praying to the Sacred Heart. But it become magic? No. So that's why for Smith, the social component is not essential in the definition of religion. Okay. All right. So I think we will stop here for a while, and we will continue to discuss the other things that are not included in this video in the coming days. I mean, the next video will discuss, no, the other elements in the definition that was not covered here, including the types of religious practices, its mutual influences, and other clarifications in the terminology of religion. Okay, so thank you very much. Please take note at the end of this video. I mean, this series. This is the first one. You will be concluding with a paper to write with regards to your definition. I mean, insights about religion, but submit that after the second video. Thank you very much.